All right, so we are going to go ahead and dive into the 12-lead EKG review assignment that I have posted on the Google Drive for you all to bring to class with you tonight. And there is a total of, let's see, I believe there's 17. Yeah, there's 17 12 leads that we will look at. There's also some case studies at the end that you can review on your own. Send me emails if you have any questions about what those interpretations would be. But I want to give you all the opportunity to do some of these case studies here at the end on your own so that you can diagnose whether or not you're getting them correct. So if you really have trouble with one of the case studies at the end, there's 5 of them. Go ahead and reach out to me by email and tell me which case study you're having an issue with. And so that you can check yourself, I will post the interpretations, the correct interpretations of those 5 case studies to the Google Drive for you to be able to reflect and check your work. So let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to do my best. This is my first time using this application to capture the screen, but hopefully it'll work for us. And bear with me as I switch back and forth between screens and switch back and forth between using the pen function to be able to draw on the 12 lead and then going back and forth between the slides. So here we are on 12 lead EKG 1. So before you dive into any 12 lead, or I guess I should say, as you become more experienced in interpreting your 12 lead EKGs, you're going to figure out your own pattern and your own technique on how to approach the interpretation of a 12 lead EKG. You could probably talk to 5 different paramedics, and those 5 different paramedics interpret the 12 lead EKG in a different format. There really is no right or wrong way to interpret the 12 lead as far as whether you look at the leads V1 through V6 first, or whether you look at leads 1, AVL, V5, V6, your lateral leads or your inferior leads. There's no right or wrong reason. Me personally, I always begin with the inferior leads. I think it's just easier for me because I read left to right, just like everyone else, and they're all grouped up there in one bunch. So when I look at the inferior leads, of course, the inferior leads are 2, 3, and AVF. I'm obviously looking, do I see any gross elevation, right? When I identify my J point and I identify my ST segment on these, do I see any elevation that sticks out to me as I go from lead 2 to lead 3 to AVF, right? And ischemia is important to note, but in the very beginning, as soon as I capture that 12 lead and I'm in the back of the medic unit, I look for ST elevation immediately across all my leads. Then, once I can rule in or rule out a STEMI, an ST segment elevated myocardial infarction, once I'm able to rule that in or rule it out, I will then go back and look a little bit more detailed to pick up on any ischemia or axis deviation or anything like that I need to be aware of. But, so let's look at leads 2, 3, and AVF. And I zoomed in here. I'm going to do my best to try to use the laser feature on this PowerPoint to identify what I would call the J point and what I am looking at for any elevation. So a good rule of what you'll hear is never use the first beat on a 12 lead EKG to interpret ST elevation. So the first beat in a lead I never look at, okay? So let's go ahead and cross out the first beat in each lead there, okay? So I'm not going to look at those for my interpretation. Now, if I have a really bad 12 lead, and let's say, well, for example, right here in AVL, I have some pretty crappy waves to look at, right? I don't really have a ton of good options there to look at. well, then maybe the first beat is my best option. I don't know. And we'll get to that when we get to our lateral leads. But typically, I never use the first beat unless, like it is in this example in AVL, it seems to be my best option. So let's go back here to leads 2, 3, and AVF. And I'm going to try to use the laser to show you what I'm looking at and what I am calling the J point. Okay? So let's see here. Turn my marker off. So right about there, okay, we're looking at the J point, or the junction between where my S wave becomes my T wave or goes into my T wave, okay, and that's called the ST segment. So the J point and ST segment are used pretty interchangeably in the interpretation of 12-lead EKGs. So we're looking for that J point or for that ST segment to be elevated by more than 1 millimeter, which is one small box, as it compares to the isoelectric line. So if I'm calling that right there my J point or my ST segment, then I would be comparing that to this isoelectric line right here. Okay? And you don't always have to go to the isoelectric line that's in front of the J point. You can go to the isoelectric line that occurred before the J point. It doesn't really matter. Just give yourself whichever isoelectric line looks the best to interpret off of. That's the one that you can use. Whether it's before that QRS complex or it's after that QRS complex, just find the isoelectric line that you feel is the best representation. Okay? So now, leads 2, I do not see any elevation. Lead 3, I certainly do not see any elevation. Again, I'll try to highlight what I would call my J point in lead 3, about right there, right at that junction where my S wave, or maybe in this case my R wave hits the isoelectric line, right, and it's dead even with my isoelectric line. And then I'll go to AVF. So my third lead for inferior. So again, I'll try to highlight with my laser here, about right there. I would call my ST segment. Okay, so you can see my my R wave, my S wave coming back down. And then about right there would be my ST segment or my J point, and it is very much so isoelectric. So from that figure alone, or from looking at those strips, I do not see any elevation in my inferior leads. So I'm actually going to, one second here. I'm going to move places. Apparently I'm talking too loud while my daughter tries to sleep. Alright. So, we've looked at our inferior leads. Our inferior leads do not show any elevation. I then typically go to my lateral leads, specifically leads 1, AVL, V5, and V6. Okay? Those are the lateral leads on a 12-lead EKG. I then go to those next to rule out elevation or rule in elevation. So as I look at lead 1, let me zoom in here, and I'm not going to go over every single 12 lead in this detail, but for the first 1 or 2, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as you're looking at this. So as I go to lead 1, again, all of these beats look fine to try to interpret, but I'll go to the second one, identify my J point, okay, being about right there, and if I bring my laser over, it is isoelectric, maybe a little under isoelectric, but definitely not elevated. Then I'll go to AVL, And remember, this is when I said that there's really no good beats in AVL to look at. This is a halfway decent one. These beats I would totally disregard. But we may have to go to this first beat to get the best reading. Either way, this first or second beat is going to be our best chance to get a good interpretation. So if I put my laser where the ST segment is or the J point is, again, I don't feel comfortable comparing that to anything isoelectric ahead of it. But if I go backwards, I can see that it is isoelectric. Okay? Now let's switch gears and look at V5, V6. We'll go to the second beat. Put my laser on the ST segment or the J point. Actually, I'm going to use this beat. It gives me a better isoelectric to look at. So there's my J point or my ST segment. As I move it straight across, I'm isoelectric. And V6 is a little tricky because we have a wandering baseline. So it looks like we have some patient movement or we have some artifact towards the end of this strip. So this is going to be another lead that's difficult to try to get a good isoelectric read off of. So we may have to use the first or the second beat. I'm going to use the second beat. And if I say my J point's right there, I bring it across. I might be a little bit elevated there, but I don't think it's anything in cardiac in nature. I think it's just because I have this patient movement and this weird wandering moving baseline going on here. But even so let's just say I have, let's say that is 1 millimeter of elevation as I move across here. Okay, let's say this baseline right here, this isoelectric line, is legitimate, which I don't think it is. I think it's depressed because of patient movement or the ambulance hit a bump, whatever it may have been. But let's say that it is elevated. Does it really matter at that point? And the answer is no, because V5 had no elevation, right? At V6, we say, there might be some elevation, or it could just be a weird baseline, I don't know. You have to have elevation in 2 or more anatomically contiguous leads to call it anything, to identify it. And right now, without having elevation in V5, without having elevation in 1 and AVL, we don't have enough evidence to support this being elevation. Okay. So now let's go back to our precordial leads. So we have our septal leads, which is V1 and V2. Okay. Now these give us a pretty good look at what's going on with the 12 lead. So V1, let's identify a good ST segment or J point. I feel like this one's a little bit tricky. I would say that our J point is right here. Okay, so right where I have my R wave come down to form my S wave comes back up to form, or to start going into my T wave. Definitely no elevation. When I go to V2, here's my junction or my J point. If I bring that over, no elevation. If I go to V3, there's my junction or my J point. I bring that straight over, no elevation. Which, I'm sorry, V3 is my one of 2 anterior leads. Forgot to mention that. V4 is my second anterior lead. So find my junction or my J point here. Okay, see where I have that laser. I find it here and I move over, I'm isoelectric. So this 12 lead is normal. This is a normal 12 lead. Okay, so no elevation, no real depression. Now, the thing is, as we talked about during when we wrapped up the lecture, STEMIs are only 50% of what we see. the other 50% of